Today I have for you a game played only a handful of days ago by Magnus Carlsen against one of the most elite blitz players on the planet, the 31-17 rated Greek Grandmaster Niko Theodorou. Wait a minute, that's John Turturro. Okay, this is Niko Theodorou, who in the game you're about to see falls victim to an unbelievable tactical sequence played by Magnus, which despite knowing who he was up against, must have left Niko utterly stunned and wondering what unearthly force had just hit him. How Magnus is able to perform such feats of calculation as he does in this 3-minute blitz game by finding this 7-move multiple brilliancy containing combination is far beyond my ability to fathom, and maybe even Magnus couldn't tell you exactly how he does it either, but let's get into it. Niko Theodorou is playing white and begins with d4. It's best in theory, second best by test, and after knight to f6 from Magnus, c4, e6, and knight to f3, we have bishop to b4 check, known as the BOGO Indian defense. And no, it doesn't stand for buy one, get one. The holidays are over, and Magnus is looking to pick up some much more heavily discounted pieces than that. So Niko, of course, needs to block the check, so why not do it with the knight to d2? That's always my favorite way to deal with these pesky early bishop checks. Now white can start harassing the bishop with a3 next, and if bishop takes knight, then white gets the capture with bishop takes d2, developing a piece, which wouldn't be the case after knight to c3. But this does block two of white's pieces, and it's a less ideal square for the knight. So there's your pros and cons. We have b6, preparing a fianchetto, a3 of course, to which Magnus responds bishop takes d2. It is the best move. Once in a while you'll see some foolish fool play bishop to e7, but then white just gets his big center for free with e4. That's not ideal. So after this mainline move, bishop takes d2 check from Magnus, Niko responds not with a developing move like bishop takes d2 or queen takes d2, but instead with the less popular anti-developing move knight takes d2. So what's the thinking here? Well, white is still toying with the idea of getting the big bad pawn triad with the move e4, supported now by the knight. But after bishop to b7 from Magnus, adding a second attacker, preventing e4, you might expect something like queen to c2, once again threatening e4, but instead Niko just plays e3. Come again? You move your knight backwards to support e4, only to play e3? Seems a bit nonsensical, but e3 is actually the engine's top choice. Probably because it retains a lot of flexibility, white is able to develop his light squared bishop at a moment's notice, and might even offer black the pawn on g2 in some lines in order to activate his rook down the g-file, or, as was the case later on in this game, he can play f3, further supporting e4 with the f-pawn. Magnus continues d6, preparing knight b to d7, and unlike the move d5, this keeps the diagonal open for his light squared bishop. b3 now from Niko prepares bishop to b2. Since he's leaving his knight right there on d2 for the time being, we get knight b to d7, bishop to b2, and now h5 from Magnus, with clear intentions to attack on the king side. But this is a bit premature and lacking in justification, since white hasn't castled kingside and he can still go queenside. After which you gotta ask, what are you really attacking over here, Magnus? And is it worth it? Now he is gaining some kingside space, but better would have been some normal developing moves like queen to e7 or castling. Niko now continues with the strong move, f3, preparing e4, while Magnus does whatever it is he's trying to do over here on the wing with his next move, h4. But at this point, Niko goes a bit awry by playing e4 right away. Turns out that the real usefulness of this move f3 was that it blocks the b7 bishop's access to g2, so that white can get in a quick bishop to d3 followed by queen to e2, which is what he should have played instead of e4. But now, instead of firing blanks over here on the king side, Magnus has a little something to target with his next move, knight to h5, eyeing that newly weakened f4 square, which has become available as a consequence of the move e4. And this discourages white from now playing bishop to d3, since knight to f4 would attack both the bishop and the pawn on g2. So, moral of the story, don't create needless holes in the area of the board where your opponent is launching a premature and wholly unjustified attack. Niko continues queen to e2 in what is now a more or less equal position, adding some lateral defense to g2, preparing to meet knight to f4 with queen to f2. Magnus continues queen to g5, putting the queen on her most active square, eyeing g2, preparing the castle queenside. And this highlights another defect of white having played e4 a bit too soon, since if you can imagine this exact position except that bishop to d3 had been played instead of e4, then white would have the move knight to e4, with tempo on the black queen. That would be quite delectable, but here the best Niko has is to castle queenside, or he can play the slightly less accurate queen to f2, which is the move he chooses. It is fairly logical, reopening the diagonal for the light squared bishop, but it has a slight defect, according to the engine anyway, since it allows black an immediate d5, which is supposedly best, and which wouldn't have worked with the queen still on e2 for tactical reasons, involving the black king's position on the same file, but we're not going to nitpick too heavily. Magnus now castles queenside, so does Niko. The engine's giving snake eyes here, total equality. Both kings now run toward the corner, even though they weren't in any danger, because that's just what kings do. They spook easily. Next is e5 from Magnus, finally contesting that pawn trio, and looking to give his knight on d7 a better home on e5 after a capture on d4. But Niko's not about to allow that when he can achieve an oppressive pawn wedge with d5, which does leave his light squared bishop with nothing better to do than stare at this well-defended black pawn on e5. But then again, Carlsen's bishop is pretty much in the same boat, being shut out by the pawn on d5. So we still have utter equilibrium, the calm before the storm, whose initial rustling arrives with this move f5, which is very standard. You of course want to attack strong pawn centers with your pawns. Niko now retreats his king to the inner sanctum on a2, opening up the possibility of winning a pawn with e takes f5, since the recapture queen takes f5 will not come with check. Then white can grab the pawn on h4 with his queen. But king to a1 may have just been a tad more accurate in lieu of what's played next by Magnus, which is knight to c5. Looking to capture e4, then hit the white queen with rook to f8. And you might be wondering about e takes f5, followed by queen takes h4 here, but with the knight now on c5, it's no longer working due to some engine insanity, which I suppose we can look at briefly. So here's the relevant line. Fasten your seatbelts for this one. It wasn't played in the game, but it goes as follows. E takes f5, queen takes f5, queen takes h4, queen to c2, hitting the rook who is defending the knight. So what can white do? Bishop to e2, that fails the knight to f4. White could defend with queen to e1, but then there's this beautiful shot, knight to g3, exploiting the pin on the a pawn. And here, if black's knight were not on c5, then white could actually defend with the ridiculous knight to e4. Here it doesn't work because black has queen takes g3 check, supported by the knight, but if that move weren't possible and black just took the rook on h1, then rook to c1 would actually trap the black queen. Truly incredible, but getting back to the game, after knight to c5 from Magnus, we have b4, giving the knight a little nudge. Magnus drops it back to d7, but a bit stronger may have been knight to a4, hitting the bishop, who would love to play to c1 with some potential discovery on the black queen, but this would fail to knight to c3 check with a fork of king and rook, which is why king to a1 was preferable to king to a2. But Magnus, in this position, does play the slightly inferior knight to d7. And here e takes f5 is still an option for white, but it's nothing to get too excited about since black can always play knight to f4, adding defense to h4 before recapturing with the queen. Of course, white does get the e4 square for his knight, but black can challenge it immediately by putting a knight on f6. So here the engine is suggesting rook to g1, getting off that h-file in order to avoid tactical tricks involving that move knight to g3. But Niko goes for rook to c1, which seems to be preparing a future c5, maybe after knight to b3. It's not a bad move, but it does remove some defense of the knight on d2, which allows the move knight to g3. It's not played in the game, but if the knight is taken, then the pawn recapture would leave both the black queen and the rook on pre, and if the queen goes to b1 to defend the rook, then the knight on d2 falls. But Magnus plays rook h to f8. It would have been better to put the other rook on f8, leaving this one on h8 and so keeping the knight to g3 tactic alive, And here the engine is again calling for king to a1, but it's now for an entirely different reason than before, which is not based on any immediate threats, but rather to eliminate a future tactical possibility available to black, which I won't reveal just yet because we will eventually get to see it executed in the game. But Niko went with rook to c3, which I don't know the exact reasoning behind. I mean, there's some potential lateral defense. The rook actually ends up going to f3 after the pawn trade on e4. Maybe he wants bishop to c1, pointing at the black queen. Magnus now continues with an inaccurate move. He plays knight d to f6, but what he should do is play an immediate f takes e4, which would force white to recapture with the knight due to the pin on the f-pawn. When he no longer has the pawn wedge, d5 is no longer protected by a pawn on e4, meaning that it's going to be much more difficult to get in the c5 pawn break without losing the d-pawn, especially after a knight lands on f6. But in the game, after Magnus's knight d to f6, he's threatening that double capture on e4 with the discovery on the white queen, so Niko gets out of the way of that with queen to e1. Magnus takes on e4, but now Niko is able to recapture with the pawn with f takes e4, which turns out to be superior to taking with the knight. Now this does give Magnus the open f-file, and he continues knight to f4, now threatening knight takes g2 with tempo on the white queen. So activity-wise, black seems to be doing pretty good, but structurally, white is the better side. The engine is now giving over a pawn advantage to Niko, who continues g3, giving the knight a little prod. The pawns are exchanged, the knight goes to h5, adding pressure to g3, but it's adequately defended. And here Niko plays an excellent move, but he plays it just a little too soon, and that move is c5. Better would have been to play that mysterious move king to a1 first, as it would avoid the tactic now available to Magnus, which he doesn't see. But take a moment if you'd like, pause the video, and see if you can spot that tactical shot now available to black. Are you ready? The move is knight takes d5, and if e takes d5, we have bishop takes d5 check, attacking both king and rook. So Magnus missed this tactical theme the first time around, but don't worry, it's going to rear its ugly head again. Or its beautiful head, I guess, depending on which side you're playing. So stay tuned for that. But for now, Magnus plays knight to g4, which looks very active, but it doesn't really threaten anything that white can't easily deal with. Maybe rook to f2 is an idea, but Niko now plays knight to f3, hitting the queen, who Magnus drops back to g6. And once again, white should play king to a1, getting off the sensitive diagonal, depriving black of any sacrificial tricks, ready to play bishop to d3 or knight to d2 to add defense to e4 if necessary. For example, if black puts a knight on f6, white's c3 rook is helping to defend g3. And despite the aggressive placement of black's pieces, he's really just firing blanks, having no way to actively counter this raging pawn storm against his castled king, with moves like c6, a4, and a5 on the way. But Niko now plays knight to h4, which is not a good move, and sort of puts Magnus back in the game after queen to f7, after which king to a1 is still the best move, but this would allow Magnus to infiltrate f2 with his queen, attacking g3, while threatening a queen trade, which of course as white you don't want, being the side with the better attacking prospects. But Niko has a plan. He now plays c6, driving the bishop to c8, and follows up with rook to f3, hitting the queen, defended by the knight. Looks reasonable, but this actually brings the game once again back into equilibrium after knight h to f6. And you might think this still looks good for white. I mean, knight to f5 is on the cards, but white actually has no way to make that move work for him. If you try it immediately, then there's knight takes e4, followed by bishop takes f5. Niko apparently sees that that's not working, so he plays bishop to d3, adding defense to e4, but now after g5, unbeknownst to Niko, his only good move is to actually retreat the knight to g2, which would pretty much concede that the knight to h4 concept was flawed, having wasted 2 moves just to reroute the knight from f3 to g2, which is clearly inferior to playing something like knight to d2 in only 1 move. But Niko, now blind to the tactical dangers, thinks he is okay to jump into f5. And I think most of you can probably guess what tactical shot Magnus now has at his disposal. But to work out all the relevant details is an astounding feat of calculation, especially for a blitz game. It requires Magnus to find a total of 7 forcing moves, only moves, some of which are even less obvious than the move that kicks off this stunning combination, which is knight takes d5, giving black a winning position. For if the pawn were to capture the knight, then queen takes d5 comes with check, as well as an attack on the rook, which will be lost. So white has lost a key central pawn, but if he's not careful, he's going to lose a lot more than that, because there is actually the threat of checkmate in 2 on the board now, with knight to c3, double check, followed by queen to a2 checkmate. So that must be dealt with. The engine suggests king to a1 once again, but Niko decides to try bishop to c4, pinning the knight to the queen, threatening bishop takes d5. But Magnus now has bishop to e6. Now if black tries bishop takes d5 here, or e takes d5, it's going to lead to the same variation. Here we have bishop takes d5, hitting the bishop on c4 twice, eyeing the rook. Now white can take on d5 again, and after the queen recaptures with check, hitting the f3 rook, white now has rook to b3, which would save the day if not for the loose knight on f5, which now falls to rook takes f5. So white is finished there. But there is another try in this position after bishop to e6 from Magnus, which is the very tricky knight to d4, with the discovered attack on Magnus's queen by the rook, who is now defended by that d4 knight, which I gotta say looks kind of bad. What are you doing with that queen? If you move her to e7, for example, then black just wins material with rook takes f8, then knight takes e6, and bishop takes d5, and you're just done. So what would you play here? Pause the video and see if you can spot black's only winning move in this position. Here it comes. The move now unleashed on the chess universe by its almighty ruler, Magnus Carlsen, which is knight to b4 with check. And checks will supersede threats to the queen every time. Okay, so let's look at white's options. If you take the knight with either the pawn or the queen, then the bishop on c4 is captured with check, equalizing the piece count, after which black moves the queen to safety and then wins with his extra pawns and now better position. So the only other option is to move the king, which is what Niko tried in the game with king to b1, leaving Magnus with 3 of his pieces under attack. The knight on b4, the black queen still being hit by the rook on f3, his bishop on d3 is attacked twice. So what to do? Is this just the end of the line for black? No. Magnus now has a single winning move, which I of course invite you to find. Pause the video one more time if you'd like. Here it comes, the epic and decisive queen takes f3. Yes, folks, we have a queen sack on the board, and after knight takes f3, the white pieces start dropping off like overripe plums. Why I thought of plums, I couldn't really tell you. But the bishop on c4 is the first to go with bishop takes c4. And if we stop and do a quick piece count, we'll see that Magnus has a rook and a knight for the sacrificed queen, plus a couple of extra pawns. So a small material plus, yet the engine is evaluating this as hopelessly lost for white, giving almost a 4-pawn advantage to black. Why? Well, after Niko grabs the knight on b4 with the queen, if Magnus were to capture the knight on f3, then the bishop on c4 is lost, and then white is the winning side. But Magnus now has the in-between move, bishop d3 check, getting that bishop out of harm's way so that after king to a1, there is rook takes f3, and Magnus keeps his material. So what an incredible calculation by the greatest carbon-based player on the face of the earth, who would have had to see this move bishop to d3 check at the end of the 7-move combination to know that his initial sacrifice on d5 was working. So incredible stuff. Did he calculate this all out, or was it played on pure intuition? Let me know in the comments what you think, but I want to press on with the game, which is not going to last much longer. We have rook to d1, now played by Niko. It's a very respectable try, as it comes with the threat of rook takes d3, which would actually equalize the game, due to white's threat of a quick queen to c4 or b5, looking for queen to a6 and checkmate on b7. Now black does have things he can do to defend, which I'll leave for you to work out if you want, but according to the engine, this chronic weakness of black's king should suffice for white to hold the draw. But Magnus is hip to this idea, and he now plays knight to f2, hitting the rook adding defense to the d3 bishop, and ready to pick up another pawn on e4, which would give him a passed pawn duo and an even more crushing position than he already has with his very active pieces. Rooks are ready to double, and if you try a rook to e1, then there's a5 to kick the queen away from the defense, and then e4 falls. Now you might already be wondering about the move Niko plays next, rook takes d3. It was good a moment ago, so what's wrong with it here? Well, Magnus is now able to recapture with the knight, attacking the queen, who goes to c4, hoping for that a6 and mate, but after knight to c5, you're not getting in, and there's no mate for you. And this reality check was apparently harsh enough to convince Niko Theodorou to now discontinue the game with a timely resignation. Magnus has the 2 rooks for the queen. With 2 extra pawns, the rooks are ready to double and invade. Any attempt by white to trade his dark squared bishop for the knight on f4 and then invade on the light squares with his queen is just way too slow and way too easy for black to deal with, as you'll see yourself if you play around with the position. So there you have it, one of the most brilliant blitz games I've ever seen Magnus play. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. Don't forget to like the video if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the bell if you want to be subscribed and notified of all my future content. Comment with anything that's on your mind, that always helps the channel, and so does watching the video all the way to the end, so thank you for that, and I will see you next time.